Witch, warlock, wise woman, healer. All these titles mean something. Folk hero or heretic. Across the history of Ireland, men and women were believed to be capable of holding the power to protect or destroy, going all the way back to the time of the Druids of old. A wise woman may cure the ill and ailing with herbs, have a certain insight into dealing with newborn children, or the wisdom to nudge a family back into the community after suffering ostracization. But human history also tells us that exceptional people, when misunderstood, are often blamed for the issues of the times. Should misfortune befall a rural community, it is often these wise ones who are doled out the blame. He did this with that power of his. I never should have trusted a seventh son. This is her doing. It's her fault the baby died. She was the last to hold him. Gossip, particularly in rural communities, served as both warning and judgment. It's likely an artifact of the rural form of life that has not quite been uprooted from the culture in the modern day. This creates a form of quiet, solitary judgment in us, typically paired with a lack of action if these judgments prove individual and internal, but not always. And so, when the collective makes up its mind about these things, the line between healer and heretic becomes thinner than the boundary between worlds on the Samhain could ever hope to. Belief was, and for many still is, a language of survival. In a climate of harsh winters, temperamental weather, and notoriously fragile harvests, fear does not die easy, and notions of witches arise often, both as wards and warnings, and fear is a powerful motivator indeed. Even so, there is awe. A cunning woman who heals a child, cures a herd of cow or sheep from illness, or is perceived to guard a place against forces unseen, was often revered. To some, this creates a folk hero, and to others, a threat to power which must be outwitted, avoided, or prosecuted. Witch, warlock, wise woman, healer. Even here at the campfire, every title holds weight, every tale carries fear, every whisper belays at least a little truth. In Ireland, superstition was not fiction, but a mechanism for the persistence of humanity. And so it's here that we begin to understand the truth behind our tales and legends, walking in the shadows of witches.
The question often arises, what did people do in Ireland long ago when there were very few priests available? And this is a question that comes back again in the present day with the shortage of clergy and the decline of the official institutional church in Ireland. And this brings us to the topic of the farfasa or the banfasa, the wise man or the wise woman. In Ireland, we never had witchcraft or witches or warlocks in the English sense or the continental European sense or indeed the North American Puritan England sense, New England. We instead had these people who were acknowledged as being wise in the ways of nature and in the spirit world. They weren't necessarily evil people. Very often they were good people, wise people, and were acknowledged as such. And under the Brehon laws, they had a special status. They were part of the Eas Dána. They had a certain aristocratic status, if you like the smiths, blacksmiths, silversmiths, goldsmiths, anyone involved in smithy work. They were regarded as having certain magical powers as well. Maybe magical isn't quite the word we should use, but they had certain powers that were supernatural. And that so they were craftspeople, they were people of knowledge, they were people who understood things, and very often they were consulted. And we can see a return to that pattern now again. People going to people who have still kept alive old ways. So in terms of Halloween as we see it now, You often see the image of a witch on a broomstick with her pointed hat and her black cat on the broomstick beside her, and that sort of thing. So let's just discuss this question of witchcraft in Ireland. So as I've said, we didn't have the continental European or English or New England Puritan sense of witchcraft. We never associated our wise men or wise women with being practitioners of Satanism, black magic, satanic masses, that type of thing. It does not exist in the Irish tradition. And on this point, I would like to draw your attention to as well another myth that's abroad, that the Spanish Inquisition had persecuted witches. No, it did not, because under Spanish law and Inquisition law, witchcraft did not exist. It was classified as a harmless superstition. So, likewise in Ireland, it did not exist as such, except it's in 1586. This is in the very late 16th century, after the defeat of the Desmond Rebellion, at the time when the plantation of Munster was taking place, the Elizabethan plantation of Munster, and you have the arrival of English Calvinists coming into Ireland and bringing with them that very puritanical Protestantism with them. It's in 1586 that you have the first Witchcraft Act passed in the Irish Parliament. All through the Middle Ages, from the arrival of the Normans right through, you had never any statutes on the Irish statute book against witchcraft. You even have the story of the great Earl of Desmond, Gerald the Third Earl, the Wizard Earl, the Poet Earl, and how he was interested in the occult arts and shape-shifting, and performed shape-shifting in his castle at Lochgar to entertain his countess, and then a cat suddenly appeared when he was in the shape of a bird, and she screamed and he vanished, and appears every 7 years on his great horse riding the shores of Lochgar until the silver hooves of his horse wear out. That's the legend. It's a great legend.
It's not so difficult to imagine a house in the heart of the village, as though the township grew around it. A small cottage, a source of sanctuary and suspicion where the wise woman dwells. The widow in there sings songs nobody else remembers to ailing children, tending to them and the anxious family who believe this hardship to be a sign of rejection from the spirits of the land and sky. To some, this figure will become a lifeline, a necessity in cold winters. Her herbs calm fevers, her songs lull children to sleep. She brews her remedies, readily provided by the village. When a child is ill in a rural community, everyone has a stake in it. Any herbs she asks for would be given freely. But trust, so hard to gain, so easy to lose. If the harvest fails despite the woman's blessings, whispers will begin quickly. She has too much power. Some wise folk were accused of tampering with the weather, summoning hail, frost, or storms to kill livestock and botch crops. More supernatural stories mention shape-shifting, with a notorious association with the hare. The hare, as discussed earlier in this series, was believed to be a vessel for fairy women to traverse our world. If someone had a suspicion a wise woman was secretly a fairy, it could explain her attunement to the land, but also a secret, hidden malice. Paranoia breeds fast in rural communities, especially when others vie for similar positions of influence. Communities relied on the insight of these wise folk, however. It did not always end in death or burning. And yet, there are instances in which that's exactly what came to pass.
Witchcraft as such did not exist on the Irish statute book until 1586, and it wasn't until 1821 that that was repealed. So it's a very short period. But in that period, almost 125 to 100 to 200 years afterwards, there were 4 major witchcraft trials in Ireland. Now, someone would say to me, what about Dame Alice Kettler in Kilkenny, the famous witchcraft trial of 1320 to 24? Yes, there was a trial, but it wasn't conducted under the law of the land. That was conducted under ecclesiastical law by the Bishop of Ossory, Bishop de Ladrede, who was an Englishman. He wasn't an Irishman. He was an Englishman, an English Franciscan. He had arrived in Kilkenny there at the beginning of the 14th century. And he came up against Dame Alice Kettler and a powerful group of people in Kilkenny itself, the bourgeoisie and the nobility. And Dame Alice was an independent-minded woman. She had 4 husbands. It just so happened that they died within a short space of time of marriage, and there were suspicions about her accumulating wealth, etc., and that she had practiced witchcraft. But the interesting thing there is it was the Dame Alice's brother-in-law from her first marriage, Roger Outlaw. He was the Justiciar of Ireland. He was the one who helped her to escape from Kilkenny. She wasn't burnt at the stake. And he was the one who took action against the bishop for conducting a witch trial under church law instead of handing it over to the law of the land. But of course, the law of the land at the time didn't provide for it. So it had to be a church trial. The bishop overstepped himself by seeking a death sentence. Exile would have been preferable. So that brought the bishop up into conflict with the Justiciar of Ireland, Roger Outlaw. So anyhow, that's just a byway. And then, of course, there was the other famous trial of a witch in 1432. That was the prioress of the convent of St. Catherine de O'Gonil, or the known in Irish as Monastery na Gaile Chaduv in Shanagolden, Old Abbey. Now, again, that wasn't a trial under secular law of the state, it was a church trial. And it was authorised by Pope Martin IV on complaints about the prioress, that she had bewitched a group of local young men and had brought them into her convent. And as the trial record said, they were her stable of stallions. You can make of that what you want, but all the other nuns left in disgust from the convent, and they apparently there was great debauchery that went on there. The other nuns had left, as I said, and complained about their prioress, and the Earl of Desmond took the matter in hand, as the convent was on Desmond land, and he had the Bishop of Limerick at the time conduct an inquisition. But the inquisition found that she wasn't guilty of witchcraft, but she was guilty of debauchery and breaking her vows as a nun, and she was ordered to be confined to her cell. And it was in 1432 that the convent was closed. The lands were given over to the Earl of Desmond, of course, and that, and the Caile Chaduv, the nun herself, the prioress, she remained immured in a cell, but she still dispensed wisdom about cures, etc., to the locals. They used to come to her window and communicate with her and bring her food and drink and everything, and she'd hand out her chamber pot and they'd empty it for her, that type of thing. So that is the legend there in Monastery na Gaile Chaduv. But even the word cailach or cailach, it doesn't necessarily mean a hag or a witch. Now we have the story of the old hag of bear and all of that type of thing, the Cailleach, in ancient Celtic mythology, the Cailleach, this hag-like figure with magical powers. No, Cailleach can mean a very wise woman, someone who understands nature and cures particularly, etc. Someone who can foretell the weather because of the signs in nature as well. It's basic physics. And it also means a nun, because in Old Irish, nuns were not called Manor Rialta, as they are now. They were called na Cailleach. And Cailleach Dubh, it was because they wore a black habit. They were Augustinian nuns. So they had a black habit and a black veil. And so they were the canonesses of St. Augustine, by the way. So they weren't just mere nuns, they were canonesses. And as a certain Spanish nobleman in the 17th century remarked of a group of Irish canonesses of St. Augustine from Killone in County Clare and St. Peter's Cell in Limerick, who had been exiled from Ireland and ended up in Madrid, he referred to them as more like countesses of St. Augustine than canonesses because of their lifestyle, and that. But that's another story again. It's quite entertaining. They introduced poitín to Madrid as a medicine, and it was the prior of the Knights of Calatrava who was supporting them in a house in Madrid, and he was complaining about all the expenses incurred in maintaining them. So anyhow, if we go to the Irish Witchcraft Act then of 1586, following on from that act, there were actually 4 state witch trials in Ireland. The first was in 1655. Interestingly, it's almost 80 years after the Witchcraft Act was passed. So, and that was of a Marion Fisher in Carrickfergus in County Antrim, and she was a member of the Presbyterian community there. The second one was 5 years later in 1660 at Youghal in County Cork, the trial of Florence Newton. And in 1698 then you have a third one in Antrim again, and then the 1711 on Island Magee, up there in Northern Ireland too, in Antrim, where you had the deaths of Anne Haltridge and Mary Dunbar. And it was a group of women who didn't attend the local Presbyterian church and spent their time smoking and drinking and carrying on with a William Seller. And they were all put on trial. Now, we don't know for certain what happened at the end of the trial, because the trial records break off. There's no statement as to whether they were executed or not. We just know they were put on trial. But in all these cases, all of them involved members of the Presbyterian community. Now, the Presbyterians are a very Calvinistic, very puritanical group of Protestants, very fundamentalist, and it is interesting that these were the women who and one man who were put on trial for witchcraft, and it's comparable to the new Salem witch trials over there in New England in the 17th century as well. The Salem witch trials, people will be familiar with that from history as well. So then the next time we have an actual trial, it's not for witchcraft, but it is for murder. And the verdict returned was manslaughter. But it involved the accusation made against the deceased for being a witch or a changeling. And that was feathered in County Tipperary in 1895, the famous or infamous burning of Bridget Cleary. Now, Bridget Cleary was a seamstress, and a very good seamstress by all accounts. She had a profitable business, and she was married, but the marriage didn't bring any children. And this was obviously a source of annoyance to her husband and also to her father. And Bridget had become ill. It was diagnosed as bronchitis at the time. But her husband, it was in March of that year she became ill, and then by the 15th of March, she ended up being doused with paraffin by her husband and burnt. And he claimed to the authorities that she had become a changeling, that she had gone away with the fairies, etc. But her remains were found in a search. It was the dog, her own dog, that led the police to where her bones, where charred remains were. And that so the husband and her father were put on trial, but the jury delivered a verdict of manslaughter by reason of insanity. But they got 15 years in prison. But poor Bridget Cleary was disowned even in death by her own family, and she had to be buried in a pauper's grave and feathered. So those are those are the basic outline of trials involving witchcraft in Ireland. And as you can see, it's a case of being associated with the Scottish or English Presbyterian settlers in Ireland, rather than coming within the Gaelic tradition or the Hiberno-Norman traditions as such. So that's by way of explanation of witchcraft in Ireland. But in terms of that, in the old Irish tradition, let's say we had this tradition of the Farfassa or the Banfassa, being well aware of the workings of nature and also the workings of the spirit world and how to deal with them. And in that context also, yes, there are certain people who are wise in these ways, but also malevolent. And these are the people who practice pishogues, the planting of rotten eggs in hay, or disposing of a dead calf in another person's property. These would be the two most widely known methods of pishoguery. And then the third one, which is less well known, but is something to look out for, the planting of ash twigs smeared with unsalted butter. Anything with salt in it is purified, and nothing evil can dwell within it. That's why we use salt with holy water, for instance, etc. It's in the ritual of consecrating holy water. And also in the ritual of baptism, the child is given salt on their tongue as well as a means of exorcism. So the unsalted butter is smeared on the ash twigs, and they're planted inside the boundary then of the person's property who is the victim of the curse. So very often in these cases, when they're discovered, usually the family experience terrible misfortunes one after the other, the cattle dying, etc., crops failing, bad harvests, misfortunes within the family. And I know personally of 3 instances of pishogues on people where the priest had to be called, and the implements of the curse, if you like, whether it was the rotten eggs or the hay and the dead calf or the twigs, had to be gathered up, and they had to be brought to a crossroads and burnt, or disposed of. Now, why a crossroads? Because there the evil couldn't go on anyone. Another way of dealing with it was to let them off in a river. Now, of course, you'd be polluting the river if you put a dead calf into it, and that. So, but the thing is that they had to be disposed of, and the preferable way of disposing of them, the one I witnessed, was by burning. So that was what was going on. And very often the people who practice the pishoes, they themselves could never swallow Holy Communion. And there was an incident involving that too in a church that I know of, where a certain person couldn't swallow the communion, nearly choked. But anyhow, as I say, these are the things. And another strange thing was very often the person who practices pishoes is related to a very holy person, could be in the consecrated religious life. So that mirrors the old spiritual idea that where you have goodness and sanctity, you will also have evil trying to creep its way in. So that's a thing we always have to remember when we hear about, scandals in the church, and that there's an old saying that where Christ has his church, Satan has his side chapel. So these things go hand in hand, and evil always trying to creep in where there's goodness. So ultimately, as I say, that's where the whole tradition of the witch comes from at Halloween. It's more an application from the English puritanical tradition of witches on Halloween. In the Irish tradition, we didn't have them. We just had the wise women and the wise men. So that's where that comes from.
Thank you for joining me by the campfire again. I would like to thank frequent collaborator of the show, Dr. Declan Downey of UCD, for his contributions again. This show would be smaller without him. Warnings, hopes, accusations, blessings, curses, burnings, a vocabulary for the unseen powers that shaped life in Ireland. Communities living within a cocktail of reverence and suspicion, living on to tell tales of men and women whose knowledge could save or could damn. Today, the long shadow of Ireland's witches has shrunken significantly. There is still an archetypical respect given to the wise elder women of this country, but the association of magic and paranoia has mostly perished. It is said that history does not repeat, but it does like to rhyme. If you listen to the world around you, you'll hear fragments of memories, the echoes of these lives from before our time. You won't hear storms shaped by malignant women or of bubbling cauldrons full of cure-all concoctions, but rather you'll hear the stories of community that refuse to die. Rightfully so. Memory is the only true form of immortality available to us. Speak of warlocks, speak of wise women, and speak of healers. Tell a tale of witches and the shadows they cast.